Hello, and welcome to the University of St Andrews. I'd like to extend a warm greeting to all of our alumni, students, colleagues, and friends who are watching from across the globe. My name's Craig Rutherford, and I'm a development officer in our development and alumni team. If this is your first Saints Talk, then thank you very much for joining us. If not, you'll know that our Saints Talks are short presentations by leading members of our academic community on key areas of our world-leading research. It's a little flavour of the expertise that our lucky students get to see on a daily basis. This evening's talk will be given by Dr. Leshu Torchin from our Department of Film Studies, which is a part of our renowned School of Philosophy, Anthropology and Film Studies. The talk will last for about 30 minutes or so, and then Dr. Torchin will be really happy to field your questions. We'll aim to wrap up the event by about 6:15 at the latest, so do please get your questions in early if you'd like to ask anything. And if you'd like to ask a question, the way to do that is to add it to the chat bar box that you'll be able to see on your screen. And as I say, do get them in early so that we can line them up and get all of your burning questions answered. Before we get into it, I'd just like to do a quick plug for the next talk in the series. You'll know we have a really varied schedule of talks throughout the academic year, and the last one for this session is scheduled for Tuesday the 25th of June. That will be our Senior Vice Principal, Professor Brad Mackay, who's going to give a talk entitled Reflections on Postgraduate Study at St Andrews, and that's a special edition one to mark the 50th anniversary of St Leonard's College, which you may know has been home to all of our postgraduate students since 1974. And Brad was himself a postgraduate student here, so he has the unique insight of being able to both talk about it from the point of view of studying in St Leonard's College and overseeing it as part of his career as well. So 25th of June is the date for that in your diaries. And you can also access the full archive of all of our past talks on a wide range of subjects, from bird migration to post-colonial theatre, on our dedicated St Andrews Alumni YouTube channel, which is where this talk will also be archived and available over the coming days. Before that, though, let's go back to this evening's topic at hand and tonight's guest. Dr. Leshu Torchin is a senior lecturer in our Department of Film Studies. She's the author of Creating the Witness, Documenting Genocide on Film, Video and Internet, which was published by University of Minnesota Press in 2012. And she's also published articles and chapters on documentary film and media for Film Quarterly, a companion to contemporary documentary film, and the Routledge Companion to Cinema and Politics. She is also the author of Cultural Learnings of Borat Make Benefit for Glorious Study of Documentary in the Film and History publication as well as a follow-up piece entitled Deepfake, Borat's Subsequent Return to America in a Post-Truth Era for the Oxford Handbook on American Documentary. Leshu is also heavily involved in our very own film festival here at St Andrews, the Sands International Film Festival. So you may have seen some reports over the last 3 years of a bit of Hollywood sparkle being brought to St Andrews, with the likes of Steven Soderbergh, Stanley Tucci, Karen Gillan and Tom Holland attending and supporting events at Sands, which has become a mainstay in the university calendar now. So look out for that, and the next edition of the festival takes place in April 2025. So we're very lucky to have Dr. Torchin here to talk to us this evening about how we understand both the work and the responsibility of documentaries in an era characterised as post-truth. Although there's never been a time of pure truth, the current non-fiction media landscape is beset by numerous challenges. Misinformation, conspiracy theories, inflammatory clickbait, deepfake and AI technologies, autocratic decrees that limit expression to combat dissent, and the waning authority of verifiable fact in the face of emotional appeals. All of these factors affect public perception of our shared world and the media that represents it. This talk maps out these challenges to non-fiction media with a focus on how the documentary industry is affected by and responds to these conditions. So, without further ado, I will hand you over to Leshu for this evening's talk. Leshu.
Hey, thank you, Craig, and thank you everyone for coming to this talk. Today I am going to discuss the questions for documentary that emerge in an era characterized as post-truth. As I set preparing this talk, I realized this was a massive topic where every example demanded more grounding in documentary history and definitions of post-truth. So my plan here is to outline the stakes and circumstances of a question that fuels directions in both my research and teaching. To that end, I'm going to provide definitions and histories to explain and provide background for the specific concerns this presents for documentary aesthetics, authority, and practices. I'll conclude then with a brief overview of the observations that follow from my explorations, at which point I can elaborate in the questions. What I want, though, is to present the issues and ideas that underpin both post-truth and documentary, so we can move beyond a true-false dichotomy and be equipped to reflect on the nonfiction media ecosystem. My question began in the aftermath of the former US President Trump's inauguration, and more specifically in the dispute over the numbers of attendees. Some of you might remember that in his first briefing as White House press secretary, Sean Spicer insisted that the ceremony drew, quote, the largest audience ever to witness an inauguration, period, both in person and around the globe. End quote. Almost immediately, U.S. news agencies and D.C. Metro disputed his statements, leading Spicer to declaim deliberate false reporting in which he supplied his own numbers and a photograph that a government photographer had cropped and edited to enhance the size of the crowds, a revelation that came a year later. Kellyanne Conway, then counselor to the president, rushed to defend Spicer, claiming that he had simply provided alternative facts, an Orwellian phrasing that generated both mockery and trepidation. She bemoaned the bias of fact checkers and suggested that, quote, Americans are their own fact checkers. People know they have their own facts and figures, end quote. And this was a startling moment for many, and for good reason. This was a leadership for whom truth was a matter of political will rather than verifiable fact. Moreover, the very notion of fact seemed to be in question. At the same time, I was also taken by the deployment of evidence in response. Photographs and statistics were brought in to counter Spicer's claims, including numbers from DC Metro and the National Park Service. Now, while I might agree with their presentations, I had questions about the certainty with which they were presented and the unquestioning faith in these facts. This is because I am old and remember back in 1997 when the number of attendees at the Million Man March also became subject to dispute. At that time, the National Park Service had estimated around 400,000 in attendance at a rally of Black American men, whilst the organizers had estimated twice that. Crowd counting experts were brought in to analyze the photographs, concluding that there were likely 837,000 present, although there was a 20% margin for error. That is to say, the science of crowd counting is not exact, and the choice of estimate is almost always political. This story I tell is not to engage in the specifics of the politics of the moment, but to mark a point of concern that a critical approach to evidence, or what constitutes evidence, seemed to be getting lost. Instead, these activities were reinvesting systems that collect and present data with unproblematized authority. In effect, the critically engaged stance produced through decades of documentary scholarship seemed to be losing its footing in the determination to hold ground against dangerous beliefs. The currency of the facticity of some sources seemed to be inflated to combat the erosion taking place in this new information economy. There was a polarization taking place with profound skepticism on the one hand and ready credulity on the other. As I saw it, this divergence would have implications for documentary and nonfiction media, how they were both seen and used. So to restate, while I was concerned about the ways misinformation and disinformation were affecting the nonfiction media that inform how we understand the world, I was also concerned with the overcorrection that impeded a productively critical stance regarding the visible evidence of nonfiction media. And I'd like to explain a bit more what I mean about this critical stance, which has been supplied by documentary scholarship. As I'm sure you're largely aware, documentary is not a transparent window onto reality, and indeed, media are not neutral delivery systems for fact. Rather, these are socially situated practices that represent reality whose meaning is shaped by history, culture, politics, and technology. And how we understand or accept the truth of a representation is shaped by similar systems. In his enticingly titled article, Jargons of Authenticity, film scholar Paul Arthur surveys 3 moments in American documentary, pointing to the ways the appearance of truth changes according to context. I'm going to draw on his premise to offer some examples of what I mean. Many of you might be familiar with those documentaries of the past, where cameras survey landscapes and people, and where a disembodied voice, often male and often speaking in received pronunciation, explains what it is we see and how to interpret it. It is a format that long held the authority to declare what was true about the world and what it represented. That authority was not inevitable, though, but produced through a combination of the voice, the image, and the identity of the supporting institution. It might have been the Empire Marketing Board or the British Ministry of Information then, and the BBC in years to follow. And it's important to remember that the identity of an otherwise supernatural speaker also figured in. Again, typically white and male and English, the voice invested the claims with authority, and in turn was reinvested with the authority to tell the truth about the world. It is a mutually supporting endeavor, and this authority was put to use as these films often promoted policies and initiatives and a particular worldview. In later years, the combination of broadcast journalism and documentary would bring this voice to an embodied speaker, although still typically male, white, and speaking in received pronunciation, or what is better known as BBC English. While early ethnographic film, those films co-made with anthropologists and scientists that documented the lives of other cultures, these typically followed in similar format. These were very popular forms of documentary style from the 30s to the 50s. They rested on that authority conferred by their producing institutions, as well as by the use of a camera, which was perceived, as the great documentary scholar Brian Winston noted, as a tool of scientific inscription. In the 1960s, however, the advent of lightweight camera technologies and sync sound helped give rise to the observational form. Here, a handheld camera holds social space and pretends to be a fly on the wall, capturing life as it occurs. This was upheld as a style and strategy uniquely qualified to present the truth of the world. It seemed hands-off and without the oversight of an institution communicated through voiceover. Its resistance to the use of former tactics also speaks to the resistance to authority that was characteristic of the political counterculture at that time, a political counterculture that also inhabited broadcast journalist spaces. This is to say, as things change, so do the strategies and images perceived as truthful. And it continues. Paul Arthur, whom I referenced, had also identified an aesthetics of failure that produces its own truth claims. Here we might consider filmmakers like Nick Broomfield, Michael Moore, and Louis Theroux, who not only place themselves in front of a camera, but have also chronicled their failed attempts to get interviews. This failure works to produce a confidence in the viewer. If they are truthful about their own shortcomings, surely they are truthful about everything else they represent. Similar to, although possibly less disingenuous than this, are the reflexive strategies many filmmakers have used, whereby they acknowledge the construction of the documentary they are making, and they are doing so in the text. The search for making meaning out of what images, stories, and characters they capture is made part of the film. In doing so, they aim to communicate a constant truth. Representations of the world and the authority they might hold are contingent upon the conditions and mechanisms through which they are produced and viewed. And I will say that reflexivity can also go two ways. It can be an honest attempt to reflect upon one's own practice in the representation of our shared world, or it can be a disingenuous gesture to claim authority on representing that world. And I hope this doesn't sound too cynical, because I'm not trying to spiral off in some postmodern relativism that disavows the notion that there is a reality or even such a thing as verifiable fact. But when we collect, filter, and make sense of this data, it is constantly shaped by the systems we inhabit. Consider, for instance, the work of Carolyn Criado Perez, whose book Invisible Women chronicles the myriad ways women have been omitted from scientific studies and those of urban planning, or past studies reliant on or promoting eugenics and race science. That is, these are fraught information systems. Even in that case, even anti-vaccination conspiracy theories can come from a legitimate space of lived history and legitimate questioning. Vaccine hesitancy and resistance in Indigenous communities and communities of color, for instance, comes from the very real antecedent of hospitals and medical facilities that conducted experiments or forced sterilizations. The suspicion here comes out of a well-founded fear, not fantasy or paranoia. The authority of scientific knowledge and the systems that produce it can be legitimately suspect. Notably, it has been mockumentary that has been particularly useful for exploring and illustrating these concerns. By replicating the aesthetic codes of documentary, it can challenge the content of documentary, those forms of instruction or claims upon the world. And it can also destabilize the documentary's assumed command over the real. It can supply a necessary intervention into the intersections of truth, power, and knowledge that coalesce in documentary. Although most often understood as a combination of the fictional with the appearance of documentary, mockumentary is a rather broad and almost complicated church. It can refer to two definitions of mock in that way, both imitation and ridicule, separately or in concert. There are fake documentaries which use documentary tropes like handheld cameras in interviews to tell fictional stories, as we see in The Office, which itself drew on the British docusoap as inspiration. There is satirical news, which can provide a parody of the format of news, broadcasting, or poke fun at the real-life subject of reportage. And there are hoaxes and stunt documentaries which are designed to fool, or sometimes accidentally do so, in order to yield truths about the world, as in hidden camera programs. So these are generative, fakes that tell truths. These are media objects that can mimic and mock documentary style and subject in ways that can reflect the moral and social qualities of the content and the ways truth and authenticity are forged in documentary. In doing so, these create a self-conscious or self-reflexive distance that allows the filmmaker and the audience to question and challenge the information provided, as well as the platforms that provide it. And although not necessarily having a distinct political goal, consider the television series of Kunk on Earth, and I have an image up here where the glorious Diane Morgan plays the distractible, rude, and ignorant presenter Philomena Kunk in her quest to provide the entirety of human history. undermining the educational and edifying ambitions of the historical BBC documentary. The program magnifies the ways the presenter's choices shape the information we receive, and even the interactions through which they collect their data. These are not neutral delivery systems, but human exchanges subject to confusion and prejudice. In some ways, these can reveal the very real hidden fabrications of documentary and other fiction media, nonfiction media, that is. This reflexivity can also allow mockumentary to challenge and return the documentary gaze, by which I mean the gaze that surveys, categorizes, and determines meaning for its subject. Up here, I have used an example from Marlon Fuentes' 1995 Bontoc eulogy, purportedly about his grandfather, a Bontoc Igorot warrior brought from the Philippines to be placed on display in the St. Louis World Fair. This direct familial connection is not, in fact, true. However, he does use archival footage of the World's Fair where natives, including 1,000 Filipinos, were placed on display for the entertainment and education of an audience. This mock becomes less a mockery and more a mock-up or invention of the personal stories, connections, and legacies otherwise lost in newsreel and scientific depictions of these people. In doing so, he speaks to larger truths of those relationships, those histories and images, as well as their legacy in lived experience and in media representations. And up here, I've included the sequence throughout the film in which a man listens to a gramophone. This is a graphic evocation of a notorious sequence in the early film, often treated as the first documentary, Nanook of the North, in which Nanook bites on the record in a performance of primitive exploration of European technology. It was a sequence that created a distinction, although it was at odds with what was actually happening. The Inuit were not ignorant or unaware of these technologies. They were well aware of them, including the camera that was ostensibly chronicling their lives for this film. Indeed, the historical accounts of the making of this film discuss how the Inuit participants also reportedly helped director Robert Flaherty fix that camera on multiple occasions. So, as Eve Oishi writes, fictional documentary does have a power and relevance for Asian American artists because of the particular ways Asian American historical records have been marked by inaccuracies, omissions, mistranslations, and caricatures. And this applies, of course, beyond the Asian American context she discusses. These cinematic calls to play challenge systems of knowledge production, teasing out the colonial, racial, class, and gender dynamics that inform what one considers true and how. So what I want to emphasize here, even in brief, is the ways that documentaries represent the real world and make claims upon the truth are shaped by and understood in the context in which they are made and received. There is not necessarily clarity in visible evidence on its own, but through the mechanisms that are recognizable as valid and authoritative. And these are shaped by numerous factors. Documentary and mockumentary have a strong tradition of critically engaging with these assumptions, asking us to reflect on the stories that we tell ourselves. In that regard, I've been wondering how post-truth will affect that practice. So next, what I'd like to do is provide a bit more of an involved definition of post-truth, including its partner fake news, as these might well have an impact on how documentaries will represent the truth and the responsibilities they have in representing the world within this context. In 2016, Oxford Dictionaries declared the word post-truth as word of the year. They defined it as relating to the waning influence of objective facts in shaping public opinion, as compared to the appeals to emotion and personal belief. Media scholar John Corner has rightly noted the grandiosity of this term, which suggests that there was an epochal shift from an era of truth to this new one. And of course, as I've already indicated in the breakdown of documentary changes over time, no such thing has ever existed. Meanwhile, historical studies of journalism and other media point to a lengthy history of concerns over fake news. But even if we want to stay within the 21st century in this discussion, the concept of post-truth had currency in the popular imagination over a decade before its appearance as Word of the Year. In 2005, comedian Stephen Colbert introduced the term truthiness to refer to the quality of preferring concepts or facts one wishes or believes to be true, rather than the concepts or facts known to be true. For Colbert, this emerged from contemporary politics, specifically the US decision to invade Iraq, an invasion predicated on an appeal to a desired truth, a cache of weapons of mass destruction, rather than an actual one. It's both ironic and apt that this term should have been introduced by a right-wing persona of Stephen Colbert, but not the man himself, a leftish liberal comedian. All of this illustrating how a satirical character is particularly well suited to navigate the increasingly porous borders of fact and fiction. Two factors have exacerbated the proliferation of falsehoods, their political currency, and the mediation of what we perceive to be true. First up would be digital media technologies. The first appearance of digital cameras, a while back, had destabilized notions of immediacy in documentary scholarship. These are unlike their analog predecessors, which allowed an imprint of light on celluloid to provide a direct relationship between the reality and the image taken. But digital images are an assembly of pixels, of ones and zeros, subject to all forms of manipulation. This loosening of indexical ties on the photographic image have carried on apace, particularly with AI and deep fakes conjuring up realistic representations whose analogs are images of the real and not the real itself. This is becoming more concerning every day on multiple levels in terms of who owns the rights to their image or information, how truthful people perceive reports of distant violence to be. All of these reports, which can inform military, political, judicial, voting, and activist decisions, as well as the data we work with. And recently, I've been thinking about synthetic respondents being used for market research and other studies. Here, AI has generated representations of human respondents to produce survey responses. Very crudely, it provides an update on the scaling done by crowd counting, but it raises questions of biases in algorithmic coding and the data that will be fed into generative AI, or what will be fed as I recently discovered, I just read an article about how Google AI was using the satirical newspaper, The Onion, as a source. So how will any of us respond to this with this information system becoming so muddied? And meanwhile, social media platforms, readily available and free from editorial oversight and fact-checking, facilitate the spread of fake news, a broad term that includes propaganda, sponsored content, partisan content or platforms, clickbait, errors and misinformation, especially as cuts in the news world mean fewer fact-checkers and copy editors. So failures of oversight are also haunting legacy media or mainstream media. There's also disinformation, which is less about error and more about intention, conspiracy theory, and satire and hoax, to name a few. As these travel, clickbait headlines can often become the story, and satire is often mistaken for legitimate news, as well as I pointed out, fed into generative AI. Here, too, comedian Stephen Colbert had supplied a word, wikiality, referring to the truth born from collective belief of a sufficiently large crowd. The portmanteau of Wikipedia and reality calls attention to the work of information systems and platforms that foster consensus over fact-checking and ideology over authentication. While capacity for crowdsourcing data and citizen journalism are immensely valuable, particularly where mainstream media can fail, the proliferation of materials online can confound even the most astute media readers, often siloed into communities by their consumption habits and affinities. Moreover, with bots now constituting 49% of activity online, one cannot even be sure if there is a real person behind the information, misinformation, disinformation, or anything that is verifiably true. Social media influences the media ecosystem by accelerating the spread of fake news, by facilitating content creation and exchange, by removing the gatekeepers, by enabling bots, and by deploying algorithms that influence search results and what we see in our social media feeds. And another contribution to this post-truth, which is already quite significant, is the rise in authoritarian leadership, whereby the weaponization of fact and fake further aggravates these conditions. Beyond disseminating falsehoods, many autocrats deploy charges of fake news to discredit news sources and deny reality. And here I recall not only the case of the inauguration that started this talk, but there's other cases, and certainly not limited to the US. Syrian President Bashar Assad refuted an Amnesty International report with, "We're living in a fake news era," and Spain's foreign minister claimed that photographs of police violence against Catalonian protesters was fake news. This language has achieved legislation in the form of Russia's President Vladimir Putin's enactment of a law that threatens to fine or imprison anyone contributing to the spread of false information. These acts undermine and endanger journalists and undercut confidence in national news media. Having the dubious benefit of illustrating how power intersects with knowledge, these acts further contribute to the waning currency of facts within deliberative democracy. So I've covered quite a bit of ground in short time, and the point has been to enhance the complexity of what seems to be a straightforward problem of falsehoods and truth-telling. What we have here are numerous challenges to our nonfiction information landscape presented in technology, politics, social practice, and a question of how documentary will, can, and should respond. Indeed, this is the question that directs my research projects and public engagement activities, which is what is happening to and with documentary. And so if, as I've addressed earlier, documentary aesthetics and the way it presents what we understand to be true changes according to context, what do we see changing now? These formal shifts depend upon the filmmakers, but also programmers and broadcasters who act as gatekeepers, aiming to serve audience and commercial interests. Now, in this regard, we might look to the return of the observational style, which film scholar Erica Balsam advocates as part of a return to a, quote, reality-based community. This is something we see in the work of the Harvard Sensory Ethnography Lab, whose experimentation in sensory perception digs into the multiple possibilities of observation as documentary engagement with and knowledge of the world. The film still I've posted here is from Mana Kamana, a gorgeous film composed of fixed long takes of people making their pilgrimage to a Nepalese temple via cable car. As viewers, we can only look straight ahead and try to engage with the interactions or complete silence we are faced with. It is a position of both extreme privilege, we get to stare and listen in on conversations, as well as a recognition of our own ignorance. We are only privy to what happens in the 9 minutes of that journey. And I've also included an image of the filmmakers here because I love the old-fashioned approach with the film camera. They sat directly across from each subject for the duration of the ride, as compared to other projects within the sensory lab where there are hidden or fixed digital cameras used to just record the reality as it unfolds. And this isn't just for the experimental. Making a Murderer, that known documentary series, relied in great part on long-form observation. And indeed, we might ask how the true crime boom in commercial documentary is influenced in part by these circumstances. Here we get numerous, involved, and lengthy investigations, not only into murders, but into scam artists and hoax. In fact, there just continue to be one scam documentary after another, which I find fascinating. But these limited series or one-off films not only entertain audiences, but also inspire them to become digital sleuths. How often do we hear about those anonymous internet hordes, a hive mind coming together to find out more about the case or uncover the identities of those previously hidden? This turn represents a more commercial representation of something that filmmakers and programmers discussed at the 2017 Doc-Salon at the Edinburgh Film Festival, the first of a series of public conversations about documentary that I hosted. Many noted that as news media faced more cuts, the possibility for extended investigation and long-form reportage had also dwindled, and therefore they saw documentary filmmakers as crucial in supplying that investigative demand. Still, there's something about this boom, the investigation into true crimes, scams, and fraud, financial and otherwise, that I find intriguing, particularly when we link it to the way our digital domain opens up space for the audiences to become sleuths as well, in that practice known as forensic fandom. How are streaming documentaries and online audiences coming together in the pursuit of truth, and what is the visible evidence that helps them on the case? There's also, the shifts in documentary topics, genres, and styles offer one direction to pursue. Another is that of responsibility. This is an ongoing question in documentary ethics, as we must ask about the obligation to documentary subjects, the characters, the documentary topics, and the documentary audiences. What might be interesting to some of you is that while these ethical questions proliferate, it is only more recently that documentary filmmakers have been coming together as a group to develop standards and codes of professional conduct akin to those that journalists have been meant to follow. And while I could go on about the responsibility subjects, which is a serious issue, as documentaries gain commercial success, I am also interested in the question of the responsibility of presenting something truthful. What obligations do programmers and exhibitors hold? Consider Vaxxed. This film, directed by Andrew Wakefield, raises the issue of definitely real fakes for documentary. This film avers that the Center for Disease Control destroyed proof that the MMR vaccine causes autism. Wakefield's name may sound familiar, as he is the British gastroenterologist whose publication in the medical journal The Lancet claimed the correlation between the MMR and autism. This study has led to people refusing the vaccine and a resurgence of measles in the UK and the US. The article was retracted and Wakefield has been stripped of his license, and yet he made this film. And this film was programmed at the Tribeca Film Festival before it was removed following public outcry. It was then programmed and subsequently cancelled in the Britain's Curzon cinemas before becoming available on Amazon. This documentary, which persists following the retraction, raises a variety of concerns, especially around questions and ethics of programming. It can be straightforward enough to say, not this documentary, but more broadly, what does that mean if we use truth as a criterion for deciding what to commission or program? Because then we must ask, who gets to decide what's true? And I promise I'm not an anti-vaxxer, but think this case raises important questions for us about programming and about those platforms whose curatorial oversight is directed primarily by profit interests, although obviously there are documentary programmers who have broader ones as well. And just briefly, I've put up an image here about the Archival Producers Alliance, who are currently developing guidelines for managing AI-generated materials in documentaries, which is already happening and a subject for concern. Some of you might be familiar with Roadrunner, which used a recreation of the late Anthony Bourdain's voice in one part. Indeed, there's a lot of activity as people who work in documentary start addressing these challenges in a more collective manner. And these questions bring me back to the documentary and mockumentary tradition of challenging documentary authority that has propagated harmful power dynamics under the guise of truth. The ethnographic narratives that simultaneously mourned and justified the colonial demise of native populations, for instance, or the race science that justified slavery and genocide. And indeed, now in addition to those, there are the truths that are propagated by partisan media under authoritarian rule, or indeed by any media outlets fearful of being persecuted or prosecuted. So here, my research has taken a turn to the mockumentary, and again, I include satire and comic documentary as well, to ask what they are doing to comment on and engage with this context of post-truth. Is there space for reflexivity and challenge in an economy where the currency of facticity depreciates and inflates with near startling alacrity? Can we risk challenging the authority of visible evidence and documentary truth when it is so destabilized, or is it more important than ever that we do so? And I realize I'm already overrunning my time, so I will stop here, and I'm happy to elaborate on any of these final points, especially around mockumentary, or to talk more broadly on any of the issues I've raised in this talk. Thank you.
Thanks, Leshu. That was a really interesting talk, and I can see that from the kind of quality of the questions that are coming through already. Before we go on to those questions, I was just going to ask you if you could elaborate a bit more on your final points there about mockumentaries. I'm going to take you up on that offer, and could you talk about how that fits into your future research as well?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and I am sorry for having dropped this off, because one of the things I can talk about the most in some ways is Borat. I'm a big fan. I'm a big fan when I saw the first film, because I found it a really fascinating case where there was this sort of stunt documentary happening that led a lot of people, as Sacha Baron Cohen sort of disguised himself as Kazakh reporter Borat, that they really weren't quite sure what was staged, what was true in this. They really couldn't figure this out. And while he was doing that, there was something very interesting in seeing how he was engaging with assumptions of truth, assumptions of difference between, when he's doing some of these stunt things. I could say that his performance as Borat is fictional, but talking to actual people, he was eliciting either real reactions or perhaps performed reactions. But when he's speaking, for example, to the frat boys and getting them to say misogynist things along with him, this is definitely, one of those things that can raise questions about what kind of productivity these fakes are having. And almost more interesting was that because of this constant uncertainty within the film, people started to investigate. People were constantly looking for what was true in Borat, what was not true, and having a really hard time. And this was made even harder because Sacha Baron Cohen was refusing to break character, even in his interviews on chat shows. Yeah. Which in itself exposed the ways in which chat show hosts, even though they're presenting this behind the scenes, ostensibly a behind the scenes look, are as much involved in a performance, and this contingent performance, if I could. And this led me to ask, in some ways, because I had been a big fan of Borat, how would he function today? And then he managed to make that second film. There was that follow-up film, which I found very interesting because of the way in which it actually managed to engage with fake news and started to make, not only was there a fake reporter engaged in fake news, but, you know, that sort of fakery, but that he started to look at this partisan content. And there's a point in the film where his daughter becomes a reporter for the Patriots Report, which is a representation of one of those very partisan news organizations. And through that, she not only got interviews that, you know, sort of figured into the film, but she received invitations to the Trump White House with the One America News Network at the time, which is one of the things then that Sacha Baron Cohen as Borat via Twitter started to circulate. So there was this fascinating frisson there. However, there was the follow-up in which this time he was not going in character. He was showing up as himself. And it might be because he was nominated for awards elsewhere, but it was also this sort of discomfort, I think, that then became clear in these two pieces of material that accompanied the release of Borat 2 on Amazon, one of which was called Debunking Borat, in which there was an overview, short documentaries, in which he was presenting conspiracy theories and why they were not true. And it was sort of a shocking, you know, there was a bit more going on there, but there was such a return to the voice of bringing in experts and having authorities come in, that I saw this sort of backtrack, even though there was something very productive going on. And to that end, I've started to look more at that, not only to write about the piece on Borat, which is coming out in that collection on documentary, but I have collected an edited collection I'm working on called Risible Evidence, in which there's a more global look at mockumentary under different circumstances that we might see as dictatorships or particularly challenging contexts of post-truth, because this exists at different times in different parts of the world. So would be having, you know, sort of interventions on, you know, what is the place of satire within Russian media at the time of perestroika, where we find out about mockumentaries and hoaxes then, or what's happening in China or India, and really looking to these contexts to see what we can learn more. I hope that answers the question. of being very
no, it does. That's great. It's really interesting as well, and that sort of links into two questions that we've had come through from viewers, both of which are quite long, so I'll try and kind of paraphrase through them. They both said thank you very much for your talk in the first place. And then Tiago Marquez has asked, he says he worries not about documentaries per se, but about kind of information transmission in general. And that even educated people now are finding it extremely hard to distinguish reality from alternative narratives. And a case in point being the conflict in the Middle East at the moment, where both sides have alternative narratives about what the truth is about what's happening there. So I think the question is, how do you see the future of society when most of its members can't distinguish reality, assuming that we can say that reality actually exists, from the alternative facts? And in particular, how can documentaries help us to process this? And the other question that was going to feed into that, because it's similar, is we have an anonymous question who's saying that they imagined when they were younger that the prevalence of smartphones and being able to document injustices would lead to a more just world, when actually the opposite seems to be true. And you know, can we explain why documentary and the kind of democratization of documentary is seeming to have such a little impact, or a small amount of impact, on international policy and government action? That's a lot to unpack there, but
It is, and it's really challenging. I mean, when it comes to how we can navigate this, I suppose that's where I have my hopes for documentary, in terms of also, for example, one of the reasons I think I came on the radar for this talk was because of the activities that I had been engaged in, where I like to bring documentaries to larger screenings, not only just for my students, but to have a lot of people come in where we can actually talk about what we've just seen and start to decode things, like to say, okay, who's behind this? Where's the funding from? What perspective on the world is it providing? And to sort of engage with makers, to engage with other people on this. So this is one way to just really continue to pay attention to what's happening and what we need to look out for, because it's constantly shifting. And I think AI is going to become far more challenging once it gets its handle on hands and all of that. But I think it really is about looking at a number of different factors that are shaping the information we're getting, and trying to see, at least if not say, okay, do I know for sure what's happening, but can I see the argument that it's trying to make about the world? And where is there corroborating evidence, or is this troubling in and of itself? And this becomes one of the areas. I will say that the amount of times that images can become complicated, or people can take images from anywhere and put them to use, has definitely been happening well before democratization or, reuse, although it has become amplified and it becomes so fast that I think it's a matter of really needing to keep up and be aware, but also hoping that with documentary filmmakers now creating these really large coalitions, which I hadn't seen in the past, of people trying to sort out what is happening so that they can create codes of conduct, there might be a way of then looking to the people involved in these kinds of projects, which I know is still dicey, but at least saying, okay, are they following codes of conduct that have been established? Where else are they going? As for the Middle East situation, that has been an ongoing combat of images, and I think it's going to be challenging. And I'm actually, I have to say here, deeply concerned overall about what the surfeit of information we have just everywhere does to sort of paralyze people from action, but also the fact that this incredible doubt in images is going to be further impeding action or creating doubt that can be mobilized. I wish, I guess, I had a better answer for a way out, more than to say we just really need to get a handle on what's happening, and also to say what can we learn from the past and what can we learn from other contexts where people have been wrestling with this before.
Yes, and I think I'm afraid to say that rather than drawing you out of these thorny situations, I was going to ask about something that you also mentioned in which is AI, and I wonder if you could elaborate maybe a bit on how that's impacting on your own work at the moment and how that's impacting on the documentary as a whole.
Yeah, well, I have to say that initially I hadn't as fully been thinking about AI, but now with seeing how it has been started to be employed in documentaries, I think this is sort of one of the places that I really do want to see how the industry is going to be handling this. And I know that's not necessarily saying how are we going to deal with this rampant AI where there's going to be this, I mean, there's going to be it really does amplify that problem of people either fully believing it as we see this happen or just fully doubting every image. But thinking about what kind of standards will be set around this, or how people will become aware of where AI seems to be giving itself away, is sort of where we're going to have to look. I'm also hoping, and this is bringing in a whole other field, but AI takes up a lot of our natural resources and could have devastating effects on the climate. And so it might be that we're facing, well, this is going to sound great, we might be facing other problems before AI becomes as big as it is. But yeah, I think it's really going to be having to look at and, sort of address these topics. I mean, more and more, and follow them and see what people are doing, which I know is, if I knew exactly, I guess I'm still looking at what's happening.
Yeah, it's an ongoing research.
Yeah.
I was going to ask also this. We've had a question from Dr. Radovich, who has asked about kind of how do you define ideology as part of it, but then also, and I don't know how far back your research goes, but they're interested in how you kind of view early documentary kind of pre-speech cinema. So, when there's just intertitles and things like that, how do you define where someone is coming from in their ideology, and how do you read that?
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, in some ways, the intertitles really do a lot of nice work in that regard. I would say, like, for example, if I go back to Nanook, which I think is a really fascinating example, even though Robert Flaherty didn't make it setting out to make a documentary, the word didn't exist at the time, this idea of representing other people, for example, to encourage this performance by Nanook, who was played by an Inuit called Alakarialak, to sort of act primitive would be one of the things. But within the intertitles, there was, in that sequence where he visits the trader, there's the bit about how he's going to trade his lovely furs that he's collected for candies and baubles and the like. And so rendering Nanook in this way as represented as childlike throughout was engaging with this ideology of the sort of West coming, or I should say the South, given that they were up north, but the West coming in with their technologies versus the childishness of the native. Similarly, even when in the sequence, when the children eat too much and get sick, it's the trader who comes in and gives them castor oil, as it's explained, to fix their bellies. So promotes the presence of this trader, this European trader, as a beneficial existence within this landscape. So I think in those regards, we can decode and find these moments of ideology. We can also see them through editing choices of how one associates one image with the image that follows, for example. And there's a lot of ways in doing that become very interesting. It's what makes documentary fascinating, even as it's quite lovely and can tell wonderful stories.
Yeah, speaking about Nanook of the North, it reminded me of the furore a few years ago when I think the BBC were accused on Frozen Planet of intercutting some footage of a polar bear filmed in a zoo, or a baby polar bear filmed in a zoo, with footage of polar bears in the wild. And on one level that seems quite innocuous, but I wonder if you could talk about, does that matter and why does it matter? There was a really big furore about it. Why is that the case? And is there a kind of, do they have a moral obligation to not fake anything, or is it's more entertaining if you can see the close up of the baby polar bear? I don't know if you've looked at that at all.
Yeah, I hadn't seen that one. Of course, I'm familiar with a lot of these furores, especially around the BBC and their documentaries, but also in part because when BBC is behind programming, they sort of present themselves. They claim to be neutral, that they're not going to be making an argument, whereas they often are. So when these discussions come up there, I'm fascinated. I guess I don't want to know how the baby was being used. I think it is, it's suspicious. It's not a great thing to do. And in some ways, I might draw on another polar bear scenario where somebody had taken was using footage of a polar bear that was looking rather emaciated and going through rubbish as example of the crises of climate change. And while there are crises of climate change that are affecting wildlife, it so happens that, as some people were saying from the area where it was living, that, well, this actually happens at certain points in the winter, particularly after, let's say, not hibernation there, I'm not sure about polar bears, but, that this happens. They become very hungry and they will go through people's food. And that's not necessarily the melting ice caps or anything. That's something that's been happening for quite some time. So it almost becomes that, while the image itself, I think because the history of using images and making meaning from them has always been kind of fraught, my concern is often with the meanings that people are deriving from these, and the presentation, the lack of perhaps being open about these decisions, that troubles me more than, saying, oh gosh, it would be really great to get a close-up here. And definitely wildlife documentaries are also interesting because they're constantly being filmed in a way to create a narrative about animal life, which is constantly a projection, I think. So.
Okay, thank you. On that, I think we're just going to have to wrap up because that's almost 6:15. So it just falls to me to thank you once again, Leshu, profusely for taking the time to talk to us on this subject, which you're clearly both passionate and world leading on. I can tell from the sheer volume and quality of questions that it's really struck a chord with lots of people. So thank you for making the time to speak with us. Sorry, Leshu, on you go.
Oh, yeah. No, I just wanted to say thank you, and also any questions. I'd love to see them because I think they're making me think and reminding me of the things I need to be working on or mindful of as I'm doing this work. So thank you.
Pass them on. Thank you. I'd also like to say thanks to all the staff who've given their time to make the arrangements for this event, because there's a lot of work goes into them and it's really much appreciated by all of us. And finally, a big thanks to all of our alumni, students, staff and friends who've watched from all around the world. We're really, really pleased to have you coming back to St Andrews virtually once every few weeks. And do look out for our final talk of the academic year on the 25th of June with Senior Vice Principal Brad Mackay. But with that, thank you very much for coming along and enjoy the rest of your evening.